Chapter 40. Pilgrim entered their apartment at La Amethyst, calling out to Dashwood. Having spent time in the vault checking on packages, she'd been pleasantly surprised that Baxter had everything shipshape and Bristol fashion. He'd been the right choice of business partner. In re-evaluating her relationship with him, the realization of just how important he'd become to her was difficult for her to acknowledge. She'd made a point of not becoming emotionally attached, but his kindness had made a mockery of it. He was the best thing that had happened to her in a very long time. He kept her straight, didn't put up with her bullshit, forgave her mistakes, and treated her as his equal despite her advanced abilities. He'd shown her unconditional love and compassion when she'd needed it the most. He'd been integral to growing the reputation of their business and to her reclaiming a life she enjoyed. He'd gradually lowered the risks she'd been taking and shown her she was valuable, needed even. He was the only person she trusted in every way that mattered. She still hadn't heard anything from him. That had been over a week ago, and in truth, she was climbing up the walls with worry. He'd never been away for so long without some form of communication between them. At any other time, she wouldn't have placed any particular relevance on his absence, but his previous warning was playing havoc with her nerves. It had forced her to delve into those thoughts she'd rather not consider. During the last week, she'd called herself stupid, that she was behaving like an old mother hen, and that Baxter was a smart man. He understood the risks and would be careful. As the days went by, with no word from him, her fears for his safety increased. She pulled off her jacket and flung it over the back of a chair before straightening her t-shirt and running her hand through her hair. "Hey, Dashwood, any sign of Baxter yet?" she tried to ask casually. Dashwood wasn't fooled. He knew she was balancing on a razor's edge of anxiety. He was baffled how she could exhibit such mental efficiency in her business life, and yet that objective reasoning didn't transfer to her personal life. He too was at a loss to explain Baxter's lack of contact. If Baxter had taken time out, he could totally understand. He'd had a few moments of reflection himself, especially given how she'd reacted to extreme emotion. He knew Baxter had shielded him at Merrilmar by keeping him at arm's length for some of her more chaotic moments. The evidential aftermath had revealed to him a highly destructive being, capable of changing matter. His own baptism of fire had come in this very, now pristine, apartment. He wasn't sure how it had happened, but he accepted her for what she was. He preferred the idea, especially given his military history, that if push came to shove, she could take care of them all. "No, Miss Pilgrim," he answered honestly. "Please don't call me that. You've seen me naked. We've moved past the formal stage," she said. "I appreciate our employee-employer relationship is somewhat unique, but I prefer to observe the proprieties," he said. "As you wish," she agreed, throwing herself into a chair. "How did Baxter seem to you the last time you saw him?" she queried, biting her top lip. He paused before concluding, "Resigned." "Resigned? You saw him last. What did he say again?" she asked. "That he'd be incommunicado for a few days," he reminded her. She shook her head. Something was definitely wrong. Baxter had been away for too long. A week ago, she'd still been undecided about deliberately exposing him to more of her abilities. She'd repeatedly turned over in her mind whether an additional exposure would help him, but she'd remained undecided. She conceded unless she tried, she'd never know. Now she concluded she should have. She'd waited until the morning of the third day to ring Merrillmar to be informed by Mrs. Flint that Baxter had not been down there since she'd been taken ill. In the last couple of days, she'd tried on numerous occasions to tune into his thoughts, without success. Finally, she'd witnessed a reflection of herself, smiling up, and had felt the pure emotion of peace from him. At the time, it had been sufficient to calm her concerns that he was okay. Now recalling the memory, it had now taken on an ominous connotation. She hadn't realized she'd sprung up and had begun pacing back and forth until she suddenly noticed Dashwood appearing to wait for her to pause. "What? What is it?" she demanded. "A call from reception. It's Monica," he answered seriously. She hadn't even heard the phone ring. A ball of iron formed under her rib cage. "Tell them to let her come up," she said. "Right away." Dashwood's pursed lips and set jaw steeled her nerve. Within minutes there was a knock at the door. He opened it to Monica. She looked considerably the worse for wear. Gone was her air of innocence. Instead, the presence of dire knowledge was writ large on her face. "Pilgrim, I wouldn't have come if it wasn't important. Have you seen Baxter?" she implored. The lack of an immediate response was enough to prompt her to blurt out, "I was at the airport, but I'm not sure what happened. I've only just discharged myself from hospital. I've been out of it for days. I haven't been able to locate him since," she said breathlessly. Pilgrim's mind raced forward. Monica had ignored her warning, thank God. She continued to follow him. She was the only one who might know what had happened to Baxter. Dashwood stood rooted to the spot, absorbing the unfolding events. "I'm going to ask some questions, and you're going to answer them factually," Pilgrim instructed. Monica swallowed, relieved Pilgrim was taking charge of the situation. "Yes, sure," she said. "When was the last time you saw him?" Pilgrim asked with a note of desperation in her voice. "The last time I saw him was 7 days ago, but the last time I tracked him was 5 days ago, to Heathrow." "I see. What else?" Pilgrim asked. "He took a night flight to Calgary last Wednesday." She hesitated, but didn't hold back. "I know you guys go up against it, but he needs help. Sometimes. We share a history. You saw what happened before. My father is extremely dangerous. I couldn't stand by and do nothing." Pilgrim felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. She'd been complicit in allowing Baxter to palm her off, that his near torture and death had been his fault, and that he'd just been careless. She should have taken preventative measures to ensure his safety. Her guilt hit her head on. Instead, this young girl in front of her had effectively shouldered what should have been her responsibility and duty to protect him. "For obvious reasons, I've hacked my father's computer, and it's not pretty. He's fixated on Baxter," Monica stated breathlessly. Pilgrim slowly placed both hands on either side of her head as the adrenaline coursed through her. The enormity of the situation was threatening to overwhelm her. Summoning all her will, she forced herself to remain calm. She asked quietly, "I'm assuming you track your father." "Yes, and that's also why I'm here," Monica said. Pilgrim breathed a mental sigh of relief. It might still be okay. She vowed she'd never let Baxter face that kind of destruction ever again. "I've checked the history of my father's movements over the last few days, and the pattern falls outside his normal parameters." Pilgrim struggled to contain her emotions as Monica continued. For approximately 48 hours, that's last Wednesday and Thursday, he showed no deviation between his office and the apartment, which isn't usual. I checked CCTV footage and he doesn't appear in any of it. I can't account for his whereabouts during that time." She paused, looking at Pilgrim with fear in her eyes. "I pulled the security footage at Heathrow," she stated solemnly. As she pulled a photograph from her pocket, she showed it to Pilgrim. "It's definitely my father." Pilgrim snatched it up. Despite its low resolution, it clearly showed Phelps with a Canada Air sign in the background. Suddenly, Pilgrim was finding it harder to breathe, and she fought for some semblance of control as flecks of light flashed in her eyes. She tried to remain calm. "So we know your father was aware you were tracking him. Do you have any evidence of his whereabouts since last Wednesday?" Her lips had become dry. "No," Monica replied. Dashwood had been observing Pilgrim and was aware her self-restraint was slipping. "What's happened to the tracking?" Pilgrim demanded, a little more forcefully than she'd intended, as a glint of iridescent blue sparked from the depths of her eyes. Monica shot Dashwood a frightened glance. "The signal is still live, but there's no movement," Monica stated desperately. "Then we need to pay Phelps a visit. Dashwood, call Brian. Tell him—" "He needs to get us to Calgary," Dashwood finished, quickly disappearing. "Monica, you're to stay here in case Baxter turns up," Pilgrim explained. Pilgrim ran to her bedroom, yanking open her side table, snatching out her passport before rummaging frantically through her wardrobe. She heard Dashwood's phone ring as she pulled a sweater off its hanger, which clanked to the floor. Stepping over to her dressing table, she picked off various items, throwing them into a holdall, and began searching around for her phone. Prompted by a quietness that had blanketed the apartment, she stopped in her tracks. Immediately, the elasticity of time undulated through her as she felt its detachment from reality, before suddenly snapping and rushing at her. Without warning, an overwhelming sadness brimmed within her, sheathing her heart and engulfing her reason. With leaden feet, she tentatively returned to the living room to see Dashwood standing with a grim look of determination on his face. "That was Brian. We'll need to give him 2 hours," he lied. It didn't enter her conscious mind that it had been an incoming call. 2 hours? She stated unbelievingly, feeling lightheaded. If she'd been able to analyze her reaction, she would have remarked how unusually accepting and yielding she'd suddenly become, but she hadn't. Her mind was already in damage limitation mode. Dashwood gave nothing away as he suggested a stiffener. Not waiting for a reply, he exited the apartment, quickly returning within seconds with a glass of wine. Her implicit trust in him meant she failed to analyze his motive. Placing it carefully in front of her, Dashwood stepped back expectantly. As the seconds elongated, she stared at the glass, fixated. When she finally looked up at him, he saw the inexorable pain clouding her eyes. He choked back his shock at the fragility he saw there. With her hand trembling, she reached out for the glass, lifting it quickly to her lips, and dutifully gulped its contents down, knowing it was for the safety of others. Its bitterness brought the back of her hand to her mouth as she gave a sharp exhale. The drug was fast-acting, and her mind recoiled under the assault. She saw the apprehension and panic on Monica's face, while Dashwood's was carved in stone. She embraced the powerful sedative as it rapidly took effect. It was potent and brutal. As it surged through her body, she attempted to keep her head upright as Dashwood ran for his medical bag. "Bastards," Pilgrim slurred as her head dropped back and a whimper passed her lips. Her tears began to well and fall. She let out a bitter laugh. With a supreme effort, she brought her head up. The desolation in her eyes caused Monica to step away from her. Pilgrim wanted to be sick, and was, as her body convulsed forward. Dashwood quickly stepped over, taking her pulse. The scale of degradation imposed to debilitate a dangerous creature was pitiably evident in Pilgrim, and he was humiliated by his role in it. A quiet knock at the apartment door sounded as if it had come from inside her head. Hansford entered, seeming to fill the space. As he quickly evaluated the situation, his face set hard. Pilgrim watched him in slow motion as he ordered Monica to leave immediately and for Dashwood to stay. Pilgrim's continued efforts to hold her head up were failing as she watched Monica's ankle turn and the heel of her shoe lift from the carpet as she walked away. Hansford's presence confirmed her worst fear. Baxter was dead. She smiled weakly, prone in her chair. "Henry, I failed you." Her grief sheared through her with a cataclysmic stroke. The roar of her soul deafened her into submission. Dashwood and Hansford were arguing, their voices becoming louder. Hansford turned to face Pilgrim. Pilgrim watched impassively as his face crumpled to stricken horror. "No, no, no!" His fearful cries reverberated beyond the walls of the apartment as rapid banging sounded on their door. Pilgrim kept the men he'd brought with him outside. She stared unseeing. With her arms laid out and her hands open, she slowly turned her wrists back and forth, and in so doing, deep slits tore through her flesh from her wrist to her elbow, quickly filling as blood rose to the top of the lacerations and spilled out. Grabbing her face in his hands, Hansford was saying something to her, but she couldn't hear him. Occasionally, a stray word from him would enter her separated mind, but she couldn't form a coherent thought. His words echoed from far away, piercing the dark. She heard only fragments of what Hansford was saying. "Baxter," he said. Dashwood was covered in blood as he frantically tried to stem the bleeding. "Positive identification by dental records," he said. Her eyes flashed before melting to black. "Death by misadventure," Hansford said. She attempted to struggle to her feet. "I need to see him," she slurred. The words, "considerable predation," glanced off the last vestiges of her consciousness, felling her to her knees. Hansford gathered Neath in his arms. He spoke desperately, cradling her head, and begged. "Neath, oh my God, Neath, you're killing yourself. You've got to stop," he rasped through her hair. "My heart's breaking," she whispered. "You're not going to do this. I won't let you do this." Scooping her up, he staggered back, placing her in the chair, his shirt and trousers saturated with too much of her blood. Staring up at Dashwood, he saw the bleak mask of defeat. Pilgrim gazed down at her hands in a stupor. They were pale, small, streaked with destruction. She retreated from the burden of her reality. An excruciating tightness at the front of her skull blinded her as she slumped back. She instinctively felt Hansford and Dashwood step forward. Her eyes shot open as her true nature fought to the surface. Its anger, retribution, and despair, a crematorial pyre that flared through the room with a seismic blast, knocking them unconscious against the walls. Lifting to her feet, she crushed the consciousness of the armed men trying to enter through the apartment door. Her mercurial nature retreated, pinioned by her grief. With no threat remaining, her shredded body rose from the floor before gently tilting back as her arms hung away from her sides. She hung suspended in mid-air. She felt the weight of the earth as it turned. She didn't want to be any more. She had no purpose or use. As she retreated into her subconscious, she accepted she was dying. Cerulean blue swathes of light began shrouding her, folding to black and filling the room as 1,000 stars amassed around her body. Her skin paled, becoming ashen, as it hardened and cracked, revealing a quivering, nebulous, metallic glow beneath the surface. Within the twilight shadow of her life, a shrouded breath said, "You are hope." But she was already far, far away. She had skimmed over the land and oceans, ascending from earth to a place where nothing could touch her. When Monica and Rika had tentatively opened Pilgrim's apartment door, having picked their way over the bodies of the unconscious SWAT team, they took in the disintegrated remains. Dashwood and Hansford remained where they'd fallen, twisted and broken, but still alive. "They're alive," Monica confirmed, bending over Hansford. "Leave them. We don't have much time. Mr. Myler has given us just 10 minutes to salvage what we can. I say we take her and get the hell out of here like she asked," Rika said. "Agreed." Lifting Pilgrim's body, Rika carried her out as Monica hastily closed the door behind them. The Whitehall office was neat and tidy. Apart from the crimson footprints that ran across the parquet floor, from the unlocked bureau where various bottles lay strewn across the white-tiled floor of the bathroom opposite. Laid out, unconscious, in the empty iron bath, with his arm hanging over one side, was the pulped and bloody body of Mr. Phelps. The now empty bottle that had fallen from his hand onto the bathroom floor was labelled "Emergency." Chios stood naked within an encasement of multi-prismed magnifying glass, his chosen place of execution. The glass cocoon was bolted on a revolving iron rod on top of what looked like a lighthouse that he'd commissioned specifically for this very eventuality. At sunrise, the first rays would hit, the optical chamber would begin to turn, and he'd be incinerated in the process. He'd taken precautions against him backing out at the end by installing an automatic locking system to secure him in place. The steel cuffs now gaped open, ready for his commitment. Slamming his ankles and wrists in to secure himself, he breathed a sigh of relief. He'd timed it to perfection. That morning, as the first of the sun's rays reached across the sea's horizon, they began to penetrate the glass. Increasing in intensity, shards of light concentrated to white-hot beams. As the prism chamber gained momentum, rotating around him, the beams began searing through his flesh from the feet up. He died within minutes, but it kept spinning long after there was nothing left but ash.